Osita has spoken at a number of our live in-person events, which of course aren't possible at the moment due to COVID-19. So it's fantastic to have him here virtually as well today to talk about developing and embedding EDI into procurement processes, which is perhaps something that certain organizations haven't looked at in as much depth as they possibly could. Osita is the head of EDI at High Speed 2, or HS2 as it's better known, Limited. He's got a huge amount of HR experience, nearly 2 decades in both the private and also the public sector, during which he's established a track record of diversity, management, training, development, recruitment, employee relations, and also policy, research and business development. Welcome, Osita.
Thank you so much, Leila, and thank you, Meenakshi, for the invite to this webinar. As you just mentioned there, Leila, it's developing and embedding EDI into procurement process. And what I'm glad to say is that the approach that we've taken at HS2 has been quite innovative, and I would say for the last coming up to 4 years, we've had this process well developed, established, and it's working well. So what I'm going to go through is really just to talk about, give some context about why diversity matters, talk through what sort of things we're doing around embedding EDI into our procurement process, and then generally sort of end with the sort of important message for our senior leaders and the decision makers in their organizations in terms of what are they doing to drive and influence on diversity. So often we talk about diversity from a business case because without it, we wouldn't be here. And so for us at HS2, diversity matters, one, because it's more innovative. Clearly, the more diverse workforce you have of people of different backgrounds who have different thoughts and have different ways of working, you're able to nurture and capture sort of innovative methods and approach and create that sort of innovation that's needed for your organizations. And it's been well proven, even within the tech companies, who has very much a more diverse way of doing things, is to create that knowledge hub, which often then translates into the sort of very things we see around technologies and thoughts around that. And certainly within our industries, engineering, rail, and infrastructure, where HS2 crosses over into those 3 areas. We aim to try and create as much in terms of innovation as possible, because thoughts around how we're going to design and build a railway is very key to that. And then the other part, which is well researched and exemplified, McKinsey report, which most of you would be familiar with, talks about the more diverse a workforce you have, the more profitable you are. And clearly that makes sense, because often then you have more inclusive policies, certainly protection of your workforce, and certainly the bottom line is key and important to drive the outcomes that you want. And certainly if you are in a position where you're targeting certain customers and you're providing your diverse customers with what they need, then that's actually what makes a difference. And we certainly know about the purple pound. So those with disability who spend money with businesses, if you have more inclusive approach to your workforce and you actually get them involved, then you're more likely to create more profit in that regard. And the third thing in terms of why diversity matters for us at HS2, and this translates very well where we're now at a stage within the HS2 program. We're 10 years into the HS2 program to design and build a railway. We've recently, as in the last week and a half, have got our notice to proceed, which in essence means we've got the green flag from government to now start the physical construction. So we've spent the 10 years prior to that doing the design, procuring contracts of those people who are going to build the railway, getting all the governance and assurance measures in place, purchasing the land and properties that are actually going to be along the line of routes, and that takes legal powers to do that. So we've had to get that from Parliament. So all the 10 years has been spent doing that, and we're now in a position to actually now start the construction. The key thing about that is you're going to have site operatives, construction workers on site, and it's been proven that the safer your site is, the more inclusive you are. So ultimately, the key thing to do is actually bring health and safety at the core of your message, have site inductions, make sure that those site inductions are accessible, so in different languages, make sure you cater for those with mobility needs. And when actually people are looking after each other, they're more inclusive, but they're also safer at the same time. So there's the correlation there with safety and sites as well for construction. So that takes us into really at a critical level, and just to talk through about the opportunities available through HS2 in terms of job creation. And ultimately, we don't design and build a railway ourselves. So those of us within the sort of core HS2 workforce, the employees, the design and build of the railway will come through our supply chain. So the thousands of contracts that we're going to award to both small businesses and those at tier 1, which are the large businesses, will be those who will actually design and build the railway because they've got the engineering experts. So in essence, we are there to manage the contract and govern and assure the whole process and make sure it meets the standard we expect. And that's precisely the role we have around equality and diversity. We have a framework, we have expectations about what we want our contractors to do. We set those requirements within the contract, and then we will govern and assure and make sure they're delivered to that standard. So all in all, we're looking at 25,000 jobs to be created by the HS2 construction. And that's over the lifetime of the HS2 program. And ultimately, part of that, we're going to be having around 2,000 apprenticeship intake. And some of those apprenticeship intake, that happens on a yearly basis in terms of recruitment. But over the lifetime, we're looking at overall 2,000. And it's quite key because one of the things that we want to be able to see through this program is the legacy of job creation and employment. Because like any major infrastructure, as with the Olympics that happened in 2012, the key is that you have something to deliver for the local community in terms of job creation and skills creation as well. And that's precisely what we're there to do. So through hiring thousands of people, we have a great opportunity to make sure we attract the most diverse pool of applicants and candidates into HS2, but also not just into HS2, but within our supply chain. And that's something we've set within the contract, that ultimately, whilst HS2 is doing the attraction and having those diverse candidates into the organization, it's equally important that we drive that through our supply chain as well. So that's reflected through our supply chain. And we've got different ways to do that. And I'll just give you some example of how we do that. So we have a blind auditioning tool, which in essence means that when somebody applies to HS2 for certain roles, not for every single role, mostly roles which are up to middle management. So if you apply for a role as a project manager, for example, you will go through a blind auditioning. And that in essence means you will have a set of tests and questions to do, which is part of your assessment. If you get through that as a first stage, then you're in a position then to go through the interview, which might be face-to-face or telephone-based or video, depending on the format that best works. And then perhaps a presentation as part of that. But that first stage assessment through blind audition, what that enables us to do is to actually not have any sort of subjective measures in place. We do not know who it is, by gender, we do not know the ethnicity. We have no indicators as to the individual candidates. What we have is the actual competency for the role, skills, knowledge, and experience. And so we shortlist on that basis. And when we do the blind auditioning, we're selecting based on the competencies for the role. So there's no way the person selecting or hiring would then be influenced by all the other biases around name and other indicators. And that works really well for us. So where we've been having blind auditioning for these roles, we've seen a shift in the number of people who enter the organization, certainly an increase by 10% of those from Black and ethnic minority background, and those who are female, an increase by 14%, where ordinarily we wouldn't have that level of those coming into the organization. So that works really well. And there are other things we do around attraction and getting more diverse candidates into the organization. So a primary opportunity for us to actually hire thousands of people.
Osita, just a couple of quick questions here whilst you are on the subject of blind auditioning, which a couple of people are writing into my chat here on WhatsApp saying it is fantastic. However, they wondered what your thought was when it comes to quotas. Now, recognizing the fact that quotas is not necessarily the most pleasant of terminologies to use, and actually proactively looking at other diverse candidates when it comes to recruitment per se, but wondered your thoughts around quotas, and if organizations or this individual's organization, or one of them I believe, doesn't use blind auditioning at this point in time, how they might be able to utilize best harnessing diverse talent from different social backgrounds.
Yeah, so I guess the case for quota, one is illegal in the UK, and where you have quotas in other countries such as the US, there's been an example that it was worked well. I think certainly it's not something we can implement here, but certainly we can start to look at things around what is your attraction and what is your employee value proposition. Because I think as a package, it's an attraction for those entering the organization from diverse backgrounds. So, how is the organization viewed? Are they a fair employer? Do they have a recruitment process that's actually simple enough and accessible enough to those applying? Because one of the things we found in the early stages, even before we introduced blind auditioning, going back to early 2016, is we had a recruitment portal for HS2, whereby those with visual impairment, hearing impairment, and other forms of disability will go through online and apply for a role. However, when it gets to hitting the apply button, it just wasn't accessible and didn't work for them. So lots of them gave up and missed out on the opportunity where there were suitable candidates, but just couldn't get through the final stage of applying online. We looked at that, we reviewed it, we made the changes necessary, and now it works really well. So I think there are things you can do to actually change the way you attract and you get candidates from more diverse background into the organization. And certainly quotas, like I said, is not one of them, because again, in the UK, we can't apply quotas.
Thank you, Osita. And just one other question here, actually, from someone who is not live today, but asked about any advice around more corporate organizations when it comes to supply chain. So this particular individual owns a social enterprise organization, and what they do is they try and get the products they have, 100% of money goes back to charity. And they're, one of the challenges they have is speaking to people within corporate organizations who are spending budget perhaps in a slightly less organized way than you with the type of way the business is set up, but trying to persuade them to spend money in a socially responsible way for those that are, say, returning parents. A particular co-founder is around kind of baby products, basically, which are 100% of the profit goes to charity. And the argument is actually that really helps make the supply chain more inclusive, because obviously they are an inclusive supplier, they're a social, responsible, social enterprise. Therefore, it's helping grow money being spent in the supply chain with inclusive suppliers. But any kind of hints, tips, advice on how we can further make that more inclusive in organisations that maybe haven't looked at this as being a top priority for D&I yet?
So is the ask in terms of small businesses, or just generally those that have corporate social responsibility as part of their agenda?
This particular business is a small business. However, I think it would be helpful to know for other businesses as well, because obviously we've got quite a few corporates and leading global organisations who are within the network. But we do also have some founders as well, which in this instance with social enterprises are often smaller and underfunded.
So there's not a simple way to answer that, but what I will do and share from experience is that I think the challenge, whether you're an SME, a small medium enterprise, or whether you're a large sort of tier one contractor, i.e. you're one of the global firms, big companies, the challenge often about making it more inclusive, particularly around opportunities to do business either with diverse organization or where you are actually looking to recruit more diversely, is to be in a position to be realistic about what's your capacity to be able to do that. I think the capacity is important because often a small business that employs maybe 100 people can only do so much in creating the more diverse workforce that they have. And an example and case in point, we had an organization who remain nameless, but they're currently awarded a contract with us. It's a family-run business. And in essence, what they do is they do they hire plants, trees and such like. And so they want a contract for us to supply us with trees and various shrubs along the line of route. So one of the things they demonstrated very well around inclusion is how they recruit. And what they tend to focus on is that they have seasonal workers because, as you can imagine, certain plants and trees can grow at certain points in the year during the season. And so what they would do is they would target their recruitment at that sort of key points to those seasonal workers, but their focus would be on those who don't normally part of their workforce, i.e. those with language skills, those who perhaps have been unemployed, but have worked in that sort of sector before. They will also look to create sort of a work-life balance for them. So it's not such that everybody works in the same way, but it's adapted so that they can work in the way that best suits them and the hours that best suits them. And that's worked with them really well because it's kept a balance between when they need the workforce that's more diverse at peak times of their business, but also when they don't need that, they don't need to have them on ongoing payroll. So again, I think it's about thinking about your business needs, balancing how you want to actually create the diversity for your workforce. I'm looking now in terms of what counts in terms of procurement and weighting scores. So just to give us some context to this, one of the things we look at is if we are going through a tendering process and the procurement team has said to us, we're going to go out and procure a piece of software, and we think that software, which is going to be on every member of staff's computer, will actually have some implications around diversity. We will need to look at that from obviously an assistive technology basis to make sure that that software is accessible and usable by different groups of people, and particularly those with impairment needs. And so one of the things we look at as part of that tender, if that tender is about to go out, we will build the EDI requirements within the contract. And we will then, at the point when we evaluate the tender, have a weighting score for the questions that we've asked the tenderers to answer. And so those weighting scores could be as little as 4%, or it could be as much as 10% in some cases. And how we scale that would be to look at what implication does that contract have and what impact would it have on diverse groups. And the more impact it would have, the higher the weighting scores we will give to those questions. And we would expect the bidder for that tender to demonstrate much more evidence of how they will meet the requirements of those from diverse backgrounds. And that's quite key. So on some of our sort of high value strategic contracts, we've been able to make a case for having a higher weighting score, in some cases, like I said, to 10%. And what the tenderers have come back with as part of their bid was to demonstrate what they will do to deliver that and how they will make a difference to those from diverse background. Without that, you're really not going to be in a position to have much impact, and you're certainly not going to have much way of measuring whether the contract is actually delivering what you needs it to deliver for those groups. And so that criteria, getting that agreed with procurement, initially it was a challenge, but where we've got to since 2016 is that it's now built in as part of the business as usual. So we're not having to make a case each time a tender goes out. So each of the procurement team has been trained, so they go through a systematic selection process, identify if there's going to be EDI impact, be in a position then to flag that up with us and says, look, this tender is about to go out, set the requirements, set the questions. We will do that. We then agree the weighting score before the tender goes out. And that works really well. And what we always tell those bidding for contract, do not ignore EDI, because I know in the realm of all the other requirements they have to meet within their tender, some of those are more commercial around price and the cost of the contract. Some of those are more technical requirements if it's a specific engineering solution. However, the diversity, things around skills, all the other bits that people think are nice to have, actually will make a difference between either losing the contract or winning the contract. So that has sent the right message. When we did a roadshow 2016 to 17, we got across to many of the local areas, cities throughout England, and talked about the opportunities with HS2. So these are people potentially wanting to bid for contracts. We told them how to do it, but also the important thing about if you want to do business with us, you need to make diversity counts too. So I think that message has got through to them. So what do we look for in terms of the sort of tendering and how that works? So we have a pre-qualification questionnaire that's set, and in essence, that sets out compliance around diversity. So we will ask potential bidders, have they had any compliance notice with the Equality and Human Rights Commission? Has there been any employment tribunal, particularly where they've been found guilty around discrimination and harassment? And what they have done to actually address those areas, because that's quite key, really. So we would not rule them out from bidding or tendering for a contract if we know they've taken action to address those areas around compliance. And once we have that, we can then move forward as part of the core tendering process and set out, as I described earlier, the requirements for their contract and the questions. And that goes out as part of the bid. Once that bid comes back and we've evaluated it and the contract is awarded, what then happens is that we have to work with those contractors as our suppliers now to make sure they fully understand, as part of mobilizing the contract, they fully understand what we expect of them around diversity, who's the responsible lead for delivering that contract. That's important. You want a liaison person, a person who's responsible for making sure it happens on their end. What's the performance measures? What are the tools? What are the support available? What training we have? What capacity building we have? So to enable them to get to the level of performance, we will support them through that as well as part of the contract management. And then we will then get a report every 6 months from the supplier telling us the progress they're making around their performance. They will submit that formally. And we're looking for evidence, we're looking for data, and we're looking for impact. I will then look through that and see whether it meets the requirement and whether we approve it. If there are gaps or areas of underperformance, we will work through with them to make sure we address that on an ongoing basis. So that forms, as a sort of loose structure, generally what we do as part of evidencing and looking at impact. So we want the evidence and the outcome over and above inputs, because people can tell you a great story about what they're doing on diversity and inclusion, but the real proof is in terms of what's been delivered. So we do challenge our suppliers to make sure they're delivering to our standard. And I guess in terms of what does the figures look like? So just to give you some idea, we tend to have measures around how our contractors are doing, and we will compare that against some industry benchmarks to look at workforce representation, for example. So workforce by way of how diverse is the workforce. And so when we look to date, for example, we look at the HS2 workforce. So this is the HS2 direct employees. And so when we look at across that in terms of diversity, we look at gender split, for example, and we have within the HS2 Limited 39% female workforce. That's the current state at the moment. And when you compare that against what is within the infrastructure sector, so again, we're looking at either rail, infrastructure, engineering, etc., and construction. The best representation for female is 17%. And when you compare that to the average for the supply chain of all the suppliers we have at Tier 1, who are mandated to deliver around equality, diversity, and inclusion, is 22% representation on average. So you can see in terms of representation what that means. We aim and we continue to challenge our supply chain to try and get to where we are at 39%. And that's often really the key here around the benchmark standard. We increasingly challenge ourselves to the point that HS2 wants to be, as part of the legacy, to be the standard by which within infrastructure others follow. So we continue to over-index what the average numbers are for those underrepresented groups. And I guess one of the things that you find out through this is that there are areas that's going to remain a challenge, both for the suppliers, and to be able to address those areas of challenge where they're not doing so well around diversity is to understand the businesses that they operate and the decisions being made. We talked earlier from the presentation about where the budget sits, how much budget diversity teams have to deliver and do and influence. So one of the things I often ask for my suppliers and also internally within HS2 is really this question, how would diversity, especially those within the diversity professions, influence the decision makers in their organization, but also within their supply chain? And how would they influence them that diversity is still important, diversity and inclusion is still important and to be valued? And I think the challenge there means that it's not left for us to find the answers as diversity practitioners. It's certainly not left for the HR professionals, where we often sit within the HR directorate, to give us the answers. It's a responsibility across the whole organization, but more so across for those senior leaders in our organization. So for example, within our senior leaders and the executive team, our chief exec, Mark Thurston, has made a commitment, and these are the visions, these are the words, that equality and diversity and inclusion is critical to our success, because of the very reasons of some of the things I've said earlier: attracting new people, tapping into a diverse and talent pool, and looking at the skills that you need to actually build a railway. So it's important that we actually tap into that. He's fully committed to it, not by way just of statements and saying that it's a good thing to do for these reasons, but actually, what are the executive team doing? So those that he sits with in the exec, we've tasked them with having a corporate objective around diversity. So each one of the exec members, as part of their performance appraisal, will have something to do around diversity. Whether that's actually ensuring that they attend diversity engagement sessions, and we've got a number of those targeted for the year, or whether they're actually in a position to attend the trainings, because they're mandatory trainings that we have, but also to champion diversity, to be a voice that opens doors. Where there are sort of gatekeepers in certain decisions throughout the business, they will be the one to sanction and give the go-ahead and champion the diversity cause. So it's important that actually your exec level, that you set challenging targets for them, and that's part of the objective that's measured. So that's something we do. The other thing that actually, in terms of influence and how senior leaders can influence, is actually be visible. Visibility is so important as part of this. One of the things we have at every meeting is a values moment. So throughout HS2, we look at values around safety. We look at values around leadership, integrity, and respect. And within the respect banner, equality, diversity, and inclusion is part of that. And so we would ask anybody randomly before we start a meeting, share with us a story, something relevant, observation, 5 minutes long around your sort of values moments. And they would do that, because that again is a recognition of, are they aware of what's going on? Are they in a position to inspire, share, and be in a position to inspire other people, because leaders are supposed to be able to do that through the organization. So it's an important part of being visible to those in the business, that you're seen to be able to share messages, and you're seen to be able to talk about things that are impactful. And I guess the other way of influencing is actually on the supply chain side. So within HS2, those are some examples of things we're doing to influence our senior leaders. But within the supply chain, there may be those who the senior leader says, well, actually, I'm given responsibility for delivering on diversity to the diversity manager. I don't need to know anything about it unless there's a problem. Where actually the challenge back is, we need you to be visible as well. We want you to be part of the discussion. So when we meet and have contract review meetings and say that you are not delivering in some areas around diversity, it's important that the project directors are there or the contract managers are there on the supplier side, because they need to understand what the challenges are, and they need to be in a position to take something away as accountable lead and make the changes required. So one of the things we're finding typically in some of the contract is difficulty for some to either identify or achieve an external EDI verification standard. So for example, it's really a part of an auditing tool that's externally audited to see where they are in the organization around achieving a standard in diversity. It might be something like disability confidence level 3. So they're a disability confident leader in the organization. Or it might be the national equality standard, for example, to attain that. And we find across the sort of 18 core tier 1 suppliers who have a contract with us, perhaps 6 of those have not either started that journey and therefore have not achieved that accreditation. So one of the challenges we've put in is that those contractors that have been with us for a year or longer must set out a plan or have achieved that standard by next year. Now, we're not relying on just the diversity managers working with their team to do that. That requires commitment and involvement from their senior leaders to influence that and make that happen. Because there is a budget constraint in some regards. And so they need the senior leaders to be able to be committed to making the budget available for that audit. There is the need to get engagement across the organization as part of that. And obviously then to look at your processes and your policies as part of that and your practices. So that again is quite important that we get those level of influence across the organization on the supply chain side. And so really when you think about what we're trying to do around how we get to this level of developing and embedding EDI within the procurement process, there is the operational side of it, but there is the strategic and influencing element to it. And without both of those working side by side, you wouldn't develop a fully functioning and effective system around EDI and procurement. So thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Osita, and it's fascinating to hear about HS2 because there really is not another organisation that is quite like it. So really interesting to hear how incredibly inclusive those processes are, and that there are a lot of quite rigorous pieces in place there. I have a question from Fiona, who says, thank you very much for giving the presentation. Apologies if she missed a piece earlier on. As with many of us, she had to dip out for a situation with her little one. But she wondered how you define specifically a diverse supplier in inverted commas at HS2. And again, we will share the slides, because I know you have gone into some of this, but how you would define those suppliers explicitly.
Right, that's a good question actually. So a diverse suppliers for us, we ask for where a business that's 50% owned or managed by somebody from a diverse background, be they a women-owned business, be it someone from an ethnic minority or somebody who has a disability. So either the board members constitute more than 50% in terms of ownership, that in itself will constitute what we call a diverse business in itself. And we actually measure the metrics in terms of, we ask our tier one to give us an account of how much money they spend doing business with those diverse organizations. So often that tier one, they will get several £1 million worth of contracts, but then they have smaller work packages. And so if a contract, for example, is to, I don't know, do tunneling project, then they go to a smaller provider who can do the site security for that tunneling project. And that site security might be a black-owned business. And so that we define it by the proportion of ownership. That's 50% or more.
Brilliant. Fiona says, thank you very much. That's very, very helpful indeed. And another quick question from Gareth, who actually saw you live at the Dial Global L'Oreal workshop, which is wonderful. Yes. He says that in the recruitment process, there is a 14% threshold which covers the environmental and diversity aspects. He says, firstly, he remembers from your presentation at L'Oreal that you said this figure was mandatory. Is that correct? And how did HS2 arrive at that figure? He's very curious to know how it was calculated.
So the figure itself is not mandatory by any means. The fact of having a weighting score and meeting the requirement is that's if you could call it mandatory. Meeting the requirement is the core part of it. So there's no way somebody can make a bid without addressing the EDI requirement. We couldn't make that figure mandatory because, like I said, it changes contract by contract. So a 14% wouldn't be a 14% on a contract that's perhaps to do with, I don't know, stationary supply. Whereas a contract that is looking at assistive technology, a contract that's looking at stations, building and designing the stations, will have a weighting score because it has more implication for those with diverse backgrounds.
Okay, that makes sense. So it isn't necessarily mandatory, but it has to be taken into account. Otherwise, you aren't ultimately going to consider.
Precisely.
So it still has to be addressed. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and hopefully that answers the question. Just another question from one of our panelists here. Hi, Osita. I enjoyed your talk today, and at L'Oreal as well, actually.
Oh,
so
great.
I was wondering if there was a turning point to drive HS2's diverse and inclusive employment approach, or has drawing skills from all parts of society been intentional from the start?
That's a good question. I guess to answer that, we, at the point when HS2 program was set up 10 years ago, the intention was to do better than what had taken place in the Olympics. So Olympics 2012 was, if you like, the benchmark. And it was the first time in the UK that we've seen diversity introduced within the supply chain and as part of procurement. Because traditionally, this has been what's happened in the US, this whole supplier diversity agenda. And so we said, actually, we can do much more. We can actually make this contractual requirement and set it within contract. So it was a conscious decision that we wanted to do that. So anybody who's bidding for high value contract through HS2 will have to meet those requirements and address diversity. because it's the culture by which we operate. And actually, most, if not all, the suppliers that will be working with us are partners of HS2. They represent HS2. And so you want to create a common culture, and where diversity is really core and important, HS2, it's got to be the same for our supply chain, because they're out there representing us. So it was conscious from the outset.
This question about you personally. So as a senior Black male within the world of work, this individual wondered whether there was any hurdles that you overcame specifically on your journey to arriving where you're at right now. This individual, who is I think they are beginning to mid-level within their journey, says there's no senior Black executives in my company, male or female, and so it's hard to imagine I could be at senior level in the company.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I can share a little story about that, a quick one, which going back to 2007, when I first stepped into what was a senior diversity role, and it was a standalone role with then an arm's length management organization. It's a property company through Basildon Council. So when they had these ALMOs, and they were bringing the homes up to decent home standards, so there's lots of things they were required to do for the stock of properties they had across Basildon. So my roles were twofold: one, to look at diversity from a service delivery perspective, but also to look at it from sort of recruitment, HR perspective as well. So having stepped into the role, met with the chief exec, I remember having a conversation with the finance director, and the question I asked the finance director was, what is the profile in Basildon generally, and what is the targeted groups that's underrepresented? And I think somehow he felt uncomfortable answering that question, and his response was just purely around ethnicity, and said to me, we don't have many Black people in Basildon, and it's quite a different area to the London that you live in. I says, well, my question wasn't about ethnicity, my question was about diversity. So I think, you know, I took away from that sometimes you may have conversations, and what tends to happen is people would look at you and your ethnicity and the fact you're a male as to why you're doing the job. And actually, you've got a challenge, which is to look at diversity more widely and look at the business case for diversity. You've also got to be able to be flexible and to adapt to what's required of you. So some of the skills that I've picked up along the way haven't necessarily been within the core diversity. There have been HR, recruitment, training. There have been things around change management. There have been things around understanding metrics, performance measures, data. So it's about demonstrating to the business that there is a wider skill set which complements your ability to perform and do diversity and inclusion. But also early on, one of the things you have to be able to do is actually know who the gatekeepers are, who the influencers are, and be in a position to not only have a relationship with them that relates to diversity, but have a relationship to them that's wider than that. And what I mean by that is, it's not when you have steering group meetings or staff networks, etc., that you're plugged into that relationship with them, but it's wider than that. So you have to be in a position where you can comfortably go out for drinks, you can just have casual conversations, just get their thoughts on things. And it's really that important, because you have to understand how they operate, how they think, and what their views are, wider than just diversity. So the key people in the organization, it's important you have that level of relationship with them. And certainly at HS2, it's been much easier to do that, certainly with Mike Thurston, the CEO, and certainly with across areas of the business with the project directors, program directors, and others such like, because unless you do that, people don't really see you they just see you in one dimension. They don't see you in multiple dimensions. So you need to build the relationships to be able to do that. And I hope that helps. That's what I can share in terms of.
That's a brilliant example. And Osita, thanks so much for sharing something of your personal self as well. And I hope I didn't put you on the spot there too much. I just felt absolutely compelled and responsible to ask this question from someone clearly who's very conscious of these things and come from the Black community. You've been marvelous and are really a fantastic role model, not only when it comes to, I know we're talking about diversity more holistically, but you are a fantastic role model when it comes to representing someone who is senior from the BAME community, who's at an exec and senior level. So very, very good in terms of role model. And hopefully for those that are or haven't considered the rail sector as a good option for their career, please do make sure you reach out to Osita. You know, I'm sure he'll be very, very happy to help and guide and advise. And you know, I think there's some really good tips there. And again, similar to what's been mentioned by both Tara and Fiona, is we must look at diversity and inclusion and belonging more holistically. It's great to look at, champion and really drive forward some of the underrepresented sectors. But for those who could be allies, or for those who are in the seats of power, in inverted commas, we must make sure we're also speaking their language and we aren't siloing out these very specific areas of diversity and inclusion. Because by making this more broad and by making this more wider reaching and inclusive, we can actually involve other people into the conversation where they don't, as you said there, Osita, you know, talking or presuming that diversity is specifically about race or gender. It's a very easy thing to do, yeah. And I think it's quite an uncomfortable thing perhaps for those that maybe aren't familiar with certain terminologies within minority groups to immediately get uncomfortable when it comes to talking about race or gender or something like that. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you for your time. Thank you all.